This is Time and Other Thieves, reflections and conversations on the nature of existence. This episode originally aired in radio format on October 13th, 2022. I'm Sarah B., and today's episode is special, is that instead of focusing on a book or part of a book that's spiritual or philosophical in nature, I'll be focusing on an album. In this case, Astral Weeks by Van Morrison. Given its central themes of transcendence, rebirth, and love, with some of the songs emerging from dreams and other subconscious phenomena, and Van Morrison's own assertion that the songs were channeled and that he didn't know what some of them were about until years after writing them, Astral Weeks really is a mystical document. That's the phrase music critic Lester Bangs used to describe the album. He also called it a record about people stunned by life, completely overwhelmed, stalled in their skins, their ages and selves, paralyzed by the enormity of what in one moment of vision they can comprehend. In Morrison, Bangs sensed an artist transfixed between rapture and anguish, wondering if they may not be the same thing, or at least possessed of an intimate relationship. I gave a lecture on Astral Weeks in 2018 at around the time of its 50th anniversary. That lecture was part of a series of in-person lectures that I helped start at Asheville FM called Music Matters. It was also part of a series of yoga classes I was starting to teach as part of my yoga teacher training called Album Asanas, wherein I designed yoga classes that went with different albums that played in the background. Astral Weeks was the first such album I designed a yoga class around, and it remained my favorite of the others that would follow, including but not limited to Bon Iver's For Emma Forever Ago, Neil Young's Harvest Moon, Arcade Fire's Funeral, and The Cure's Disintegration. I recently came across the notes I used for that Music Matters Album Asanas Astral Weeks lecture, and I thought they'd make a good episode of Time and Other Thieves. Hopefully you will agree. Astral Weeks was released in November of 1968 on the Warner Brothers label when Van Morrison was 23. Its title came to him while he was looking at a friend's painting. The cover of the album is a double-exposed photo of some leafy tree branches and a close-up of Morrison's downcast face, his shoulder-length red hair parted on the side. Joel Brodsky created the image. That's the same guy who took the famous photo of Jim Morrison, that would be called Young Lion, that one where he isn't wearing a shirt and has his arms spread out and his face is all perfect and beautiful. He's got that beaded necklace on. The Astral Weeks cover also features a circle within a square, which apparently portrays the mystic symbol of the union of opposites, the sacred marriage of heaven and earth. The songs on this album, Morrison's second solo release, were a departure from the amplified, raucous rock of his first, Blowin' Your Mind, which did have an exclamation point, and the music he'd made before that with the band Them. Morrison said that the idea for an acoustic album came to him after he had a dream that there were no more electric instruments. Recorded in 3 sessions between September 25th and October 15th, 1968, so right around this time, 54 years ago, many of the songs were captured on the first or second take. Morrison has called the recording sessions uncanny, saying it was like an alchemical kind of situation, but also awkward. Morrison didn't introduce himself to any of the session musicians, let alone say anything else to them throughout the entire recording process. He just holed up in the vocal booth and started playing his guitar. His antisocial behavior gave stand-up bassist Richard Davis more than enough reason to later refer to Morrison as a strange fella. Davis, by the way, also played bass on Springsteen's debut album and on his 1975 release, Born to Run. The other musicians featured on Astral Weeks are Warren Smith on percussion and vibraphone, Larry Fallon as conductor and composer of string arrangements, which were all overdubbed. He also played the harpsichord on Cyprus Avenue. Barry Cornfield on acoustic guitar in The Way Young Lovers Do. Connie Kay on drums, Jay Berliner on classical and steel string acoustic guitar, and John Payne on flute and soprano sax. Payne said that Morrison didn't make a good first impression on a personal level, but playing with him was a different thing altogether. He could tell that Morrison, quote, heard everything I played and was reacting to it. His phrasing was not independent of what I was doing, and I had never experienced that. This was alive. But Payne got the feeling that Morrison was in a lot of personal anguish and said that he seemed spaced out a lot of the time. Payne himself was just 22 at the time of the recording session. You can hear him do his thing on the lead-off title track. By all accounts, the song that appears on the album is the very first take. Payne says, the interaction between Jay Berliner, guitar, and me playing off each other, and the whole way Van was just there listening to it was just amazing. I still think it's the best thing in the record, he says. The first track. So here it is, Astral Weeks by Van Morrison. Of course, in the radio version of this episode, I did play the actual song. Copyright laws prohibit me from doing that on a podcast, so all I can do is urge you to go listen to the song yourself, even if you've heard it 1,000 times before. Van Morrison, the title and lead-off track to his 1968 solo sophomore release, written when he was just 22 years old. That was the song Astral Weeks. And here I am, he sings, standing in your sad arrest, trying to do my very best, looking straight at you, coming through. One of the things I love most about Van Morrison is the way he repeats certain lines. Like in the song we just heard, he says, there you go, taking good care of your boy, seeing that he's got clean clothes, putting on his little red shoes. I see you know he's got clean clothes, a-putting on his little red shoes. And then the album, Astral Weeks, as a whole, I especially love how spiritual Morrison's music is. The title track we just heard has refrains of, to be born again, ain't nothing but a stranger in this world, and got a home on high, way up in heaven in another time. One critic observed that its repetition of in another time and in another place provides an invitation to the rest of the album, which succeeds in transporting listeners thusly. I'm Sarah B., and on this episode of Time and Other Thieves, I'm exploring Van Morrison's Astral Weeks, which Bruce Springsteen said gave him a sense of the divine. Steve Van Zandt said the album was like a religion to the E Street Band. Elvis Costello called it the most adventurous record made in the rock medium. Van Morrison himself said Astral Weeks was originally planned as an opera. He's also said that it's just a random assortment of songs, and that the arrangements on the album are too samey, and that the string overdubs, which he'd never wanted, ruined it. He's also said that Astral Weeks is not a personal record, but totally fictional, a composite of conversations, movies, newspaper stories, etc. And as I mentioned earlier, Morrison has asserted that the songs were just channeled. They just came through. He told writer Richie York in 1979, I didn't know what some of the stuff on Astral Weeks was about until years later. If the spirit comes through in a Madame George type of song, that's what the spirit says. You have very little to do with it. You're like an instrument for what's coming through. Though recorded in New York City at Century Sound Studio, Astral Weeks was planned, shaped, and rehearsed in Boston and Cambridge, where Morrison lived and performed for most of 1968. He was 22 at the time, reeling from his years on the rock scene as frontman of the tough Belfast band Them, who blew up with the song Gloria. Under the tutelage of manager Bert Burns, who also brought us Neil Diamond, Morrison came to New York and scored the pop hit Brown Eyed Girl. Burns saw him as a rock and roll version of the Irish poet Brendan Behan. He died of a heart attack in 1967, leaving Morrison's Bang Records contract under the supervision of his mobster friend, Carmine DeNoia. Morrison spent the summer of 1968 playing rock clubs, roller rinks, high school gyms, and amusement parks across New England with a group of local musicians under the name the Van Morrison Controversy. He was moody, threw tantrums, and walked off stage before completing sets. But his talent shone through enough to attract the attention of the record producer Louis Merenstein, who eventually came to Boston and summoned Morrison to a meeting at a recording studio. "My whole being was vibrating," Merenstein later recalled about watching Morrison play. "It was Van, alone with a guitar, and he played Astral Weeks, the song for me, right then and there. I got the distinct feeling that he was going back in time, going back to be born again, and it moved me, spiritually, quite a bit. It hit me right where I was at that point in my life." Another Warner Brothers executive named Joe Smith, who'd seen Morrison perform at the Catacombs in Boston, bought his Bang Records contract from the mob for $20,000 in cash. Smith described Morrison as a hateful little guy, but also the best rock and roll voice out there. Warner Brothers producer Louis Merenstein insisted that most of the band Morrison had been touring with that summer not be on the studio recording. Those musicians were John Sheldon, a 17-year-old guitar prodigy, Tom Kilbania on stand-up bass, and drummer Joey Bebo. Instead, he gathered an elite group of session musicians, the aforementioned Warren Smith, Larry Fallon, Barry Cornfield, Connie Kay, Richard Davis, Jay Berliner, and John Payne. None of them had even heard of Van Morrison before recording Astral Weeks with him. In their first session together, there were only 3 sessions total, and only 2 of them produced songs that made it on the album, they laid down the tracks for Beside You, Cyprus Avenue, and the epic Madame George, which hit the 5, 7, and 9-minute marks in their final versions, respectively. All of these songs are excellent, but given my time limitations, I'm going to skip the track Beside You and play Cyprus Avenue now, with the hope that I'll also have time for Madame George later in the show. Van Morrison doing Cyprus Avenue off his sophomore solo release, Astral Weeks, which I'm talking about today on Time and Other Thieves. Recorded on September 25th, 1968, Cyprus Avenue is the end and centerpiece of the album's first side. It describes a street in Morrison's hometown of Belfast, which he called a very mystical place where I could think. The longing for youth that shows up throughout the album takes on a more troubling form here in what seems to be an adult yearning for a 14-year-old girl. Or this is what some critics have said about the song. I think these critics lack imagination and haven't considered the lyrics closely enough. So let's do that now. First, I want to point out, though, that this song contains one of my all-time favorite lines in music. "I'm conquered in a car seat." I love this line for the way Morrison, in his Irish accent, says conquered, and I love it for its implications. What does it mean to be conquered in a car seat? That's for us to decide. The verse goes, "And I'm caught one more time up on Cyprus Avenue, and I'm conquered in a car seat. Not a thing I can do." I interpret this to mean that Morrison is caught by nostalgia. He's parked on this road from his childhood, a place that he considers mystical and where he can think, and that is what he's doing. He's caught up in thought and remembering his youth. And all the little girls rhyme something on the way back home from school, and the leaves fall one by one and call the autumn time a fool. Then we learn that he's tongue-tied, can't speak, and his insides are shaking, and he decides to go for a walk along the railroad tracks with a bottle of cherry wine. But wait a minute, he sings. "Yonder come my lady, rainbow ribbons in her hair, 6 white horses and a carriage. She's returning from the fair." So rainbow ribbons don't necessarily imply 14-year-old. And there's that odd funeral procession reference with the 6 white horses. At the end of the song, though, Morrison actually says 14-year-old to close out the following verse. These lines come after a transcendent repetition of the phrase, way up on, which to me alludes way up on high. But he's also referring to Cyprus Avenue, which in his mind is positioned up high since he repeatedly says he's caught up on Cyprus Avenue. And the repetition of way up on, alluding to way up on high, aka heaven, suggests that he's singing about someone in heaven, which maybe explains the 6 white horses from the earlier verse, when he sings, way up on the avenue of trees, keep walking down in the wind and the rain, you keep walking down when the sun shone through the trees. It also seems like he's time traveling here, like he's actually beyond time in this moment, or in a place where many moments in time are happening simultaneously, as suggested by the lines, keep walking down in the wind and the rain, you keep walking down when the sun shone through the trees. This you he's addressing just keeps walking down in all types of weather at the same time, and down and down and down through his memory, perhaps back to when he was 14, or thereabouts, and in love with another 14-year-old, because the next line is, so young and bold, 14-year-old. All adults were 14-year-olds once, and according to some theories on time, we are still 14 somewhere. No moment ever really ends. So instead of concluding that the 22-year-old Van Morrison is singing about being in love with a 14-year-old, I think it makes more sense that he's speaking in the present tense about a past love from 8 years prior. Now we'll get into the most epic track on Astral Weeks, Madame George. Van Morrison, the centerpiece of the second side of Astral Weeks, and at 9 minutes and 46 seconds, the longest song on the album, that was Madame George. Morrison originally called it Madame Joy, which is actually what he sings, but he changed it to George after recording. Like the song we heard before it, Madame George is set on Cyprus Avenue and has been described as a heartbreaking reverie and a cryptic character study filtered through a childlike vision leaping into view, to borrow a phrase from the song. Hope you've enjoyed this episode, learning a little bit about Van Morrison's album Astral Weeks, which music critic Grail Marcus called a singular achievement that was way outside of history. I have only played 3 of the songs on the album, and I'm going to leave you with the closing track. I have not played Beside You or Sweet Thing. I didn't play the song The Way Young Lovers Do, which some critics have said sticks out like a sore thumb. I'm inclined to agree. Didn't play Ballerina either. That's a lovely one. But I love the closing track, so I'm going to leave you with that one. Close out the episode with Slim Slow Slider. Once again, if you do want to hear that song, you'll have to check it out on your own, and I hope you will, especially if you've never heard it. Definitely a death song par excellence. I'm Sarah B., and I thank you so much for listening to this episode, edited from its original radio format, which I did way back in October of 2022. I want to leave you with some of the lyrics from a song I did not talk about today, and it is one of the most beautiful songs in the world from Astral Weeks. It's called Sweet Thing, and it's just another great example of what a spiritual record this is, and how it really does seem like Van Morrison was channeling the divine. He says, "And I will stroll the merry way and jump the hedges first, and I will drink the clear, clean water for to quench my thirst. And I shall watch the ferry boats, and they'll get high on a bluer ocean against tomorrow's sky. And I will never grow so old again, and I will walk and talk in gardens all wet with rain. And I shall drive my chariot down your streets and cry, 'Hey, it's me, I'm dynamite, and I don't know why.' And you shall take me strongly in your arms again, and I will not remember that I ever felt the pain. And I will raise my hand up into the nighttime sky and count the stars that's shining in your eye. And just to dig it all and not to wonder, that's just fine. and I'll be satisfied not to read in between the lines. And I will walk and talk in gardens all wet with rain, and I will never, ever, ever, ever grow so old again.